Today, we are cracking open the central arguments of Christina Hoff Sommers' 1994 book, Who Stole Feminism? Now, this is a text that really lit a fire under a lot of people by asking a pretty provocative question about where the feminist movement was heading, especially inside the world of academia. The book kicks off with this very quote. And yeah, you probably did a double take. Ovular? Did I read that right? You sure did. And that one single word is our doorway into a much, much bigger conversation. So what's the deal with swapping out seminar for ovular? Well, the author, Christina Hoff Sommers, she argues this is way more than just a funny word choice. For her, it's a perfect little window into a huge ideological shift happening deep inside academic feminism. All right, let's unpack this a bit. The argument here is that changing a word isn't just about the word itself. It actually points to this deeper desire to completely reshape the very foundations of how we think about knowledge. So, the thinking, as it's laid out in the book, goes something like this. The word seminar comes from the Latin word for seed, which gets tagged as masculinist. So ovular is put forward as the female version. The author then points to other examples you might have even heard before, like history becoming her story. The bigger point she's making, though, is that this is all part of a larger movement to just throw out traditional ways of thinking, labeling them as phallocentric, centered entirely on a male point of view. And this is really the key. This isn't just playing with words. The author presents this as a flashing sign that there's a huge split, like a fork in the road for feminism. And to really get her argument, we've got to look at the two different paths she lays out. And that brings us right to the absolute core of the book, the author's distinction between what she describes as two totally different types of feminism. So the author lays out these two distinct camps. On one side, she defines what she calls equity feminism. This is your classic liberal idea of wanting a fair field and no favors for everybody. The goal is to work with men in one universal human culture. But then, on the other side, she defines gender feminism. This, she argues, is an ideology that sees all of society as a rigid system of oppression, a patriarchy, and its goal is a total conceptual revolution from a strictly women-centered viewpoint. She even goes as far as to call them the reasonable and the unreasonable sisters. And this distinction, it's everything to her whole argument. The author claims the big problem isn't just that these two groups exist. It's that the people in power, university presidents, people running foundations, government officials, they can't tell the two apart, and she argues this has some really profound consequences. So how does this whole thing play out in the real world? Well, it leads us right to the main target of her critique, the transformation of our colleges and universities. The argument is that for gender feminists, the point isn't just to study the world, it's to fundamentally change it through education. Now, to get the motivation here, the author talks about something called the click experience. It's described as this sudden, almost light bulb moment where you become aware of your own oppression. And in this academic world, that click is the moment you supposedly realize that the entire traditional curriculum, history, science, art, all of it, is a male creation made by men for men. And that realization, she writes, is what sparks the call for a complete teardown and rebuild. And according to the book, this rebuild follows a pretty specific roadmap. The author points to Peggy McIntosh's 5 phases of curriculum change. It all starts with phase 1, traditional history. Phase 2 just sprinkles in a few great women, but that's not enough. Now, phase 3 is where things really shift, focusing on women as victims, a phase that's described as being, involving getting angry. Phase 4 is a bit more of a healing stage, more inclusive. But the ultimate prize is phase 5, a totally reconstructed knowledge base, a new reality that's described as being, as yet unthinkable. So what does this transformation actually look like when the rubber meets the road? The author gives a bunch of examples of what she calls the rewriting of the traditional canon. Underneath all this, the author argues, is a whole new theory of knowledge. So traditional knowledge, which gets labeled vertical thinking, is described as being male-oriented. It's all about mastery, excellence, and playing the doubting game of logic. And this gets contrasted with lateral thinking, which is described as female-oriented. It's relational, inclusive, and it plays the believing game. And the book points to what it sees as concrete results of this shift everywhere. In history, you see textbooks giving more ink to lesser-known female figures than to central male ones. In art, the whole idea of a masterpiece is put on trial. In literature, you see polls where professors are elevating contemporary authors over classics like Melville. And finally, even science and logic themselves are critiqued as being phallocentric or just too male-centered. And to show just how extreme this critique can get, the author quotes the philosopher Sandra Harding. Now, Harding suggests that because of its aggressive, penetrating approach to nature, Newton's masterpiece of physics could be provocatively relabeled Newton's Rape Manual. So, the author argues that these shifts don't just change the focus of education, they also change the actual content, which leads to what she calls the rise of filler. She actually coins a term for this, filler feminism. The claim is that history textbooks are getting padded with information and interpretations that aren't there for historical accuracy, but to teach a very specific ideological lesson about female importance or victimhood. As proof of the consequences, the author points to this 1989 study, and what it found was pretty eye-opening. More high schoolers could identify Harriet Tubman, the knew that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, or that Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union. The author presents this as a big red flag that priorities in education have shifted away from what she considers foundational knowledge. And she argues this isn't just some abstract academic trend, She points to a California law at the time that actually required textbooks to represent the contributions of men and women in approximately equal number. She critiques this as a demand for representation that could end up overriding historical fact. So, all of this brings us to the author's conclusion and the one big, unanswered question that she really leaves hanging in the air. When you boil it all down, the book's final diagnosis is that this entire project, this revisioning of the curriculum and rewriting of the canon, is born from a really deep resentment of a past where women were, for the most part, shut out from power and prestige. And so the author leaves us with this direct challenge. She's not denying the injustices of the past, but she asks, why should the response be to resent and rewrite it, instead of just focusing on building the future? That's the central, provocative question at the very heart of the book, and that's where we're going to leave our look at the arguments in Who Stole Feminism.